Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, Republican tax legislation in 2017 was completely misguided. Despite our best efforts, the bill passed in the middle of the night. It was completely partisan. Not a single hearing. There wasn't a single Democratic amendment. And this is what that bill looked like. As I repeatedly pointed out, the Republican tax plan gave 572,000 taxpayers with incomes over $1 million more in tax cuts than the 90 million Americans who had incomes below $50,000 a year, making income inequality worse in this country, Madam President. In all, 43% of the benefits of the GOP bill went to the top 5%, households with incomes over $319,000 per year. It's why I came down to this floor repeatedly to oppose that tax bill. Since 2001, the United States of America has borrowed $5 trillion from the Chinese for the privilege of giving tax cuts mostly to the wealthiest people in our country. We never paid for any of it. We said the tax cuts would pay for themselves. They never have paid for themselves. And instead, we issued bonds, we issued debt. The Chinese bought most of that debt to finance tax cuts for the wealthiest people in America. And over that period of time, we've actually made income inequality worse during a time when income inequality is the highest it's been since 1928. And we've had no economic mobility for 50 years for the bottom 90% of Americans, for 9 out of 10 Americans. Madam President, if I had to summarize my town hall meetings in Colorado, a place with one of the strongest economies in this country, it would be that people come to those town halls and they say, Michael, we are working incredibly hard, and no matter what we do, we can't afford housing, we can't afford health care, we can't afford higher education, we can't afford early childhood education, we can't afford a middle-class life, is what they're saying to me. The vast majority of people. I said that in an editorial board recently, and somebody said, do you mean the vast majority? I said, yes, the vast majority. That's what it looks like when you've got an economy that's not driving growth from the bottom up, when only the people at the very top are the ones that are benefiting from it. For people that don't come to my town halls because they're too busy working 2 and 3 jobs, but are the people that I used to work for when I was superintendent of the Denver Public Schools, a school district where most of the kids live in poverty, most of the kids are kids of color. I know what their parents would say if they weren't too busy to come to my town halls. What they would say is, we are killing ourselves. We are killing ourselves. And no matter what we do, we can't get our kids out of poverty. And that is straining at our democracy. It's straining at the whole idea that we are a land of opportunity when there is no economic mobility for 90% of Americans. And when people that are in poverty, no matter how hard they work, can't get out of poverty, can't get their kids early childhood education, can't get their kids decent health care. In many places in the country, have no access to early childhood education, even if they could afford it. And notwithstanding this challenge over the last decades, what we have done in Congress is borrow money from the Chinese to give tax cuts to the wealthiest people in the country. That's not all we've done. We borrowed another $5.6 trillion to pay for 20 years' worth of wars in the Middle East. That's 11 or 12 and $13 trillion that, from the vantage point of the people struggling in this economy, we might as well have lit on fire. For that amount of money, we could have fixed every road and bridge in America. We could have increased teacher salaries by 50%. We could have paid for preschool for every kid in America who needs it, and that's every kid in America. We could have made it easier for people to afford college. Instead of having to spend 5 years of their life paying back their college loans, like some of the pages who are here tonight are going to have to do when they graduate from college. We could have made Social Security solvent for my kids' generation. We could have paid down some of our deficit and our debt, which is now over $1 trillion, thanks to the irresponsible policies of the president with the able assistance of the majority leader. And tomorrow, I take no pleasure in saying this, we're being asked to vote on something that will make the Republican tax bill much worse, effectively repealing the cap on the state and local tax deduction, what is known as the SALT cap. It is a bad idea. But before I get into that, I want to acknowledge my colleagues' very legitimate concerns who are going to be supporting this legislation. First, the Trump administration designed the SALT cap to take revenge against people who didn't vote for Donald Trump, to take revenge against some deep blue states and districts. Tax policy shouldn't be designed with political retribution in mind. Every single passing day, this guy who's our president looks more and more like a tyrant or a dictator who believes that the only people he serves are the ones that voted for him, and that he doesn't have a responsibility for the rest of the country. And that's not right. And I can see why people would want to correct that injustice, and it is an injustice. And I'm not here to defend that injustice. It's wrong. Second, the Treasury rules to implement the SALT cap are overly broad in ways that harm existing programs with legitimate purposes. Nobody should be surprised at all that the Trump administration issued another sloppy policy that makes unnecessary opponents out of potential allies. That is, after all, their general approach to governing. But while I agree with these concerns from the proponents of the resolution, I believe we can address all of them in a much more effective and targeted manner than undermining the SALT cap. Some proponents have said this isn't actually about the state and local tax deduction. And if we wanted to write a bipartisan bill that isn't about SALT, we could deal with the other tax policy issues affected by the Treasury rules. But this is about the state and local tax deduction. So let me be very clear. The vast majority of the benefits of repealing the SALT cap would go to high-income Americans. Repeal would be extremely costly. And for that same cost, we could finance much more worthy efforts to help working and middle-class families all over the country. Let's take a look at what lifting the SALT cap would do. These are the incomes of Americans, starting over here with people earning less than $25,000 and over here with people earning more than $153,000 and everybody else in between. The benefit of this bill, this resolution, goes to the people at the very top. The top 0.1%, which are people that get have $3.3 million of income on average. The top 1% who have an average income of $755,000, and the next 4% who's at $319,000. Together, that comprises the top 5% in America. And under this resolution, the top 5% will get 83% of the total. 83% of the benefits will go to people making more than $319,000. 56% of the benefits go to the top 1%. 56% of the benefits go to the top 1%. People making $755,000 a year. If we want to help the middle-class families that are harmed by the SALT cap, there are much less expensive and better targeted ways to do it. To put this in some perspective, SALT cap repeal is even worse for inequality than the Republican tax legislation. Far worse. To summarize, 83% of the benefits of the SALT cap repeal go to the top 5%. 83% versus 43% in the GOP tax bill. We can say we're for a progressive tax code and for fighting inequality, or we can support the SALT deduction, but it's really hard to do both of those things. And I feel really strongly about it because of how irresponsible the other side has been. I know that's not the objective of people on my side, but the way we approach these issues really matters to the American people, so they know who we're fighting for. Instead of repealing the SALT cap, which gives 83% of the benefits to the richest people and makes income inequality even worse in America, for almost exactly the same amount of money, we could cut childhood poverty by 40%. That sounds like a useful thing to do for America at a time when you've got the worst income inequality that we've had since 1928. In 1 year, we could cut childhood poverty in America by 40% with a simple change to the tax code that Sherrod Brown and I have written called the American Family Act. It costs about $1 trillion over 10 years, which is about what the SALT cap costs. That would be a much more valuable use of our resources than giving the money to the people that are making more than $319,000, especially after the Republicans have already passed the irresponsible bill they passed, and we've passed $5 trillion of tax cuts since 2001, almost all of which went to the wealthiest people in America, making income inequality worse. Instead of investing in our country, vainly waiting for it to trickle down to everybody else. And you can see here, these are almost the same income levels that you saw on the previous page. Who benefits from the American Family Act? 31% of the benefit goes to the people that are making less than 24%. Not 54% going to the top 1%, but 31% going to the bottom, the lowest income earners in America. Then 24% go to the folks that are a little less poor than that, and 19% and 19%. And if you're making above $119,000, you get 2% of the benefit of it. That to me seems like a much more reasonable approach. At a moment in the country's history when income inequality has been on the rise, economic mobility has been stagnant, when we have an education system, and I say this as a former school superintendent, with no joy at all, when we have an education system that's actually reinforcing the income inequality we have rather than liberating people from it, because the best predictor of the quality of your education is your parents' income, to the point of savagery. That is your best predictor, because your parents' income is an excellent predictor of where you will live, and that is an excellent predictor of the education we will have. The American people are desperate for relief in this economy. Republicans have made matters much worse by passing the Trump tax bill. And I think Democrats should be on this floor fighting for progressive legislation that supports working people, that gives people a chance who are living in poverty to lift themselves out of poverty, and to give kids in this country a fighting chance no matter what the circumstances of their birth is. And the good news is all of those things are available to us. If we would come together in a bipartisan way and actually invest in our country again, create a tax code that actually drives economic growth for everybody, not just the people at the very top, rewards work again, ends childhood poverty, delivers an education system that liberates people from their economic circumstances instead of shackling them to that, pursuing a climate change policy that actually drives economic opportunity throughout the United States in rural and urban areas. We have an incredible opportunity in front of us as a democracy to change the way our economy works so that everybody benefits from it when it grows. That's how you build a strong democracy. Donald Trump doesn't understand any of that, which is why he's pursued the policies that he's pursued. And it's important for us to fight those policies as well as offer ideas like the American Family Act, like the increase the Earned Income Tax Credit, like passing paid family leave and raising the minimum wage. These are things we could do that would make an enormous difference to working people all over this country, and I believe that's the agenda that we should be pursuing. Madam President, with that, I yield the floor.